the noon whistle just blew in Fort Atkinson, which is my cue to introduce myself. Steve Larson here of the HOARDS Dairyman staff. We're glad to have a nice bunch of you with us today on what's a hot, humid day up here in Wisconsin. We hope things are going okay for you folks wherever you are around the country, and we're glad to have you with us today. I could point out again that the PowerPoints could be printed out. Just go to your control panel, see the handout icon, and take your pick of how many PowerPoints per screen you want, and you can do that. And so we always welcome our co-host and partner Mike Hutchins, and Jim Baltz, his partner down there at the University of Illinois. And then we always like to thank Patty Hirchin up here in HOARDS Dairyman staff, who does a lot of the mechanical things regarding the broadcasts for us as well. And having said that, it is our co-host who is going to be our presenter today, Mike Hutchins. Feeding for Hoof Health, brought to you by Zenpro Performance Minerals, and we appreciate their support of this webinar today. And Mike, with those comments, I will let you take off.
Well, very good, Steve, and we're excited to be back on the webinar for July. And, you know, Steve, I think we have a really great topic to discuss here today, one that currently has a lot of applications to dairy farmers, to veterinarians, to hoof trimmers, and, you know, even consumers enter in on this fray just a little bit. We're going to be talking feeding for hoof health. We struggle a little bit if that should be foot health or hoof health. And a couple of times, one of my colleagues said, Hutchins, you have a foot, but cows have a hoof. Well, if we go back and forth, my apologies on it. So let's get started here and talk a little bit about as we lead into our webinar for today. And it'll be fairly fast-paced. We got about 40 minutes of stuff to cover with you today, and you'll have 3 polling ones as well. I want to look at 3 facts that are probably pretty important. What is the prevalence of lameness on dairy farms? And the Iowa State people have summarized, went through a bunch of research and said on the average lameness, and we'll define that in just a few minutes, typically 21 to 55%. In fact, Nigel Cook just published a paper in the Journal of Dairy Science, surveyed some 66 herds in Wisconsin, averaging 90 pounds of milk, averaging 850 cows. There's almost 10,000 cows in the study, and that was 13%. And these are some of the very best herds in Wisconsin. Individual farms, you can see, can be as low as 3%, may reflect some of our pasture situations, and unfortunately as high as 80%. So it's out there. Lameness is going to be a factor on dairy farms. Fact number 2. This is a big one, Steve, and that is farmers seeing it. If you look at some English data, some data done here in the U.S., the farmer's perception of lameness, they're only seeing maybe a quarter of the case. In other words, you may have, let's say, 20% lame cows and they see 5%. So that's really a tough thing to do if you don't perceive the problem on the farm and in terms of treating it then or helping these cows survive. And that really is kind of the magic word. Then we go to factor, and we look at this PowerPoint, and of course, you might say, this cow's got a lameness problem. We can see that inflammation down there in that below the dew claw area there, and of course, this cow's got some pain. You can see she's got her front legs crossed here, so maybe you would pick that one up there, but again, you'd have to be looking, and the question is, how often are we looking at hooves, unless, of course, we're milking in the parlor, and if you are the milker in the parlor to see that as well. The third factor, and I think this is one that really concerns me, Steve, and that is it can become a very important animal welfare issue. Basically, this has been an issue in Europe. Looking at reviewing the literature here, they're watching for it right now, and of course, we all are well aware of the tail docking argument that's going on, removing horns and using polled cattle. Well, certainly, we're going to see antibiotics are on that screen now. We're going to see certainly this whole question about lameness of cows, and obviously this is the last thing our consumers need to see here at this. And of course, some of our companies already have made some movements with the yogurt companies saying on GMOs, for example, they can really enforce this as we move down the line. So As a dairy farmer, you might say, well, what are some of the consequences of lameness on dairy farms? And we pretty well covered the first one, Steve. Well, let's go to the second one, locomotion. This is pretty important because these cows tend to not want to walk. They tend to want to lay down. And, of course, we just saw recently from the Minard Institution the average overloading on farms have really increased the last couple of years because of milk prices. And it changes the posture, how these cows actually walk themselves. It can also affect the shape of the hoof or the foot in this case. Culling rates we'll see in just a few minutes here. Obviously a dramatic effect on reproduction and of course can reduce and have an impact on reproduction. All these things add up to that culling rate risk that farmers are going to face. Here's some data that Iowa State people pulled together looking at lame cows versus non-lame cows, looking at starting at about 95 days in the breeding cycle. You can see that as far as culling these cows in long term, about 5 to 6% the non-lame cows, 31% the lame cows. So the factor is about 6 times higher that risk in terms of getting these cows pregnant. More about that in just a few minutes. Another number that came out of that same journal article looking in terms of cystic ovaries, and that may reflect energy balance and feed consumption and stress on cows, immune system, about 2.6 times greater risk of developing cystic ovary coming into the breeding window. So really a lot of red flags pop up here for our listeners and people that are online here today. Well, let's define lameness, and I'm not sure everybody will agree with me on this, Steve, but in today's, we're going to define lameness using the 5-score program developed at Michigan State and championed by Zinpro. They've really marketed this one pretty extensively. And so depending on how this cow walks and stands, we can grade out, and actually our students here at the University of Illinois in 10 minutes, or we were just recently down at Clovis at the Southwest Conference down there, 10 minutes, these kids are all experts on that. I'll let you review this. We got a couple pictures, though, from Zinpro we want to share with you to simply show. They say one picture is worth maybe 1,000 words. The word we're going to use today is a score 3 is a lame cow. A score 3 cow is a lame cow. So we go to these, and again, we give a reference to the Zinpro Corporation for allowing us to use these pictures here. You can see this is a score 1 cow, and as she's walking on the right and stopping, she remains flat. So that'd be a score 1 cow. We'll give you some benchmark numbers here that we can take a look at. A locomotion's 2 cow score. When she stops, of course, she levels right out, but when she's walking, she arches her back or her top line slightly. That's your score 2 cow. A really neat time to score cows is in the exit parlor coming back from milking. And usually when I'm standing there, the cow looks at me and says, "Who's that weird guy standing at the fence line?" And then says, "You know what? I'm still hungry. I'm going to go eat." And therefore they will stop, and then they will take off. A score 3 cow is permanently roached. That's a term I'd like to use. Notice the head of the cow will see some bobbing there as well. She has a different gait, in other words, striding of the of when she's walking as well. So you can see these cows coming down the aisle pretty nicely. More about that, we look at some other ways of scoring cows. Here is your 4 and 5 cows, and of course they are now depending degree of favoring their position. I believe Nigel Cook groups these together, saying, well, if they're favoring 1 or more limb, there are 4, and don't even go with 5. But of course, these are really tough cows as far as that goes. And you can see the references on the bottom if some of you want to check out where this stuff was published. So, Jim, we're going to open up the first poll, and we'll see how people want to vote on this. And Steve, we'll let you vote as well and carry on. Which of the following is probably the most expensive loss associated with lameness? Is it milk loss? Is it death loss? Is it culling loss? Or is it fertility loss? So the polls are open now, and Steve? You're thinking, I can see.
I am thinking. Milk seems the most logical.
Okay, so Steve is...
the most expensive loss probably is culling. Because if they're gone, you have to replace them.
Oh, well, listen to that. Let's see. We're at right about at 64%. I guess we can close this off, right, Jim? Let's close it off, and let's. They're voting, and the next one will be a slower one. This is the easier vote, and so Jim, you're going to pop this up I don't see it yet. Oh, here it comes. Okay. And the voting is for you Democrats, Republicans. Milk loss, Steve, maybe you should have stayed with your first one. 47%. About half the people pick that. Your second, your choice. Your first choice, second choice, however you want to call that. 31%, 22%. And death loss came in last as far as that goes. Well, actually, we're going to give you the answer right here. So if some of you printed off the PowerPoints, we would be off and running. Whoa, Mike, one too many here. Back up. A paper by Dr. Chuck Gard at Cornell University summarized this. And Steve, you can argue, but here sits all the numbers. So you can see death loss of $44, culling $192, and again, replacement cost, that's pretty close as far as that goes right now, at least with the numbers I've seen. Milk loss, you can see $170. Now that's 9-cent milk, and I think they probably adjusted for feed costs. There's no such thing as free milk. So that number may be pretty close as well at 9 cents there, although it depends how you want to argue that. If we go to 14 cents right now, then obviously that one becomes number one, Steve. Reproduction, $60 and treatment, $32. Grand total, $498. I mean, this is right in league with mastitis now. And of course, some of you know metabolic disorders. Dr. Gard did some of that work a couple of years earlier. So Zoetis has redone that. A lot of those are in that $300 range as well. Milk fever, DAs, and things like that. So let me tell you, this is really expensive. In the European papers yesterday claimed that this is the second most expensive loss on dairy farms in Europe, with mastitis being the very first one. So this is economically a big factor. This study comes from California. Davis, and it looks at, I like this one. There's a couple things to take a look at. They went out and scored a bunch of cattle, and this is what they came up with. 75% score 1. That's a nice number. And of course, Steve, in a perfect world, we'd love that to be 100%, wouldn't we? But certainly 75% score 1, 15% score 2, score 3 is 9%. Score 3, and then you can see 1% of the cows that were actually physically lame, very detectable as far as that goes. Let's take a look at the New York Quality Assurance Program that they have. On Saturday, we reviewed that, and they're saying 15%. So if the auditor comes to your farm and he or she does an audit on that, if you're over 15%, then you'd get dinged on that. If you really want to play hardball, I heard a year ago a presentation by PETA, and they want that number to be less than 1%. Totally unattainable, in my view, unless you're on total pasture systems, and then you would have a chance maybe to get at that level as well. So certainly some interesting benchmarks. Let's go to the next column over, and my pointer is working well. Jim, I guess you'll see my pointer there. Again, you can see that when you score 3, a 5% milk loss. So you can see that's about 1,000. If you got the average Holstein cow or cows in the United States, 20,000 pounds of milk. Bingo, there's the number that Chuck Gard has right there as well. And then, of course, these cows are really in trouble down here. Now, this one catches my eye. Look at dry matter intake participants. You can see already score 2 cows already are dropping dry matter intake 1%. That's why some of these cows may get a little bit on the thin side. And then my score 3 cows, you can see 3% dry matter. So if they're eating 50 pounds of dry matter, that's 1.5 pounds of dry matter. And so that can really have impacts on milk production and reproductive performance on cows as well. So all these things are happening out there. And so today, on today's webinar, we're using a score 1 and 2 cows are not lame, score 3 and 4 and 5 are considered lame cows. So we look at those cows that have a score that greater than 2, which means your 3s especially. Look at this data. 2.8 times greater risk of days to first service, 15.6 times greater risk of increasing days open, 9 times increased times risk services per conception, and Steve, here's your number, 8.4 times greater risk that this cow is going to be culled. If I don't get senile and forget this, we now have farms who see cows that are 3 that put them into a catch pen, and they have someone that's skilled at the farm pick that hoof up to be sure that there is something they can do to help that cow out, either by trimming, if it happened to be a nail, for example, penetration, a stone bruise, or some type of thing trying to help this out. That may be a take-home message some of you want to think about, and that is we don't want these cows to become 3 because now you run this gauntlet of risks out there. Well, let's get down to the meat of the presentation. I thought we need to spend a few minutes talking about laminitis. That kind of sets us up for some of the feed challenges that you and I are going to talk about, Steve, here in just a few minutes. So let's talk about laminitis. The definition, pretty straightforward. You can see this is the inflammation of the hoof tissue, of the vascular hoof tissue. And you can see the derivation of the word there. There are 2 types of laminitis or lamni. The sensitive, which is associated with the bone, and the insensitive associated with the hoof wall. And a number of these pictures come from a Zimpro publication that you're going to be referenced here at the end of our presentation. So that's an inflammation of the hoof. You and I may ask, well, what causes this and what does the animal do? And again, coming from the Iowa State publication here, that's going to be at ADSA in their ebook, the sensitive lammi die without getting oxygen to it. So it's not like the hoof is bathed in blood tissue or vessels and veins. We have to move that blood across, and the tissue will actually die because of reduced blood flow. And that wants to move forward on me, Jim, automatically. It happened when we were practicing. Sorry about that. Then the corium part of the foot becomes inflamed. This inflammation and edema then causes pressure inside the hoof wall, and that leads to pain. And so now this animal says, this is not good. And so she stops doing as much walking. This reduces some of the natural pumping action in the hoof itself. The blood flow stagnates inside the hoofs, and that causes more damage. So it just kind of cascades ourselves into more and more problems. A really neat photo there on at the bottom of your PowerPoint there. We're not going to walk you through it, but you can study this at your leisure. That's the beautiful thing of those that you've printed this out, and or you can go back to the archives, and simply shows when you have the vascular damage, we get a constriction of the blood and some coagulation of blood there, and that starts our whole thing going on. What can cause that might be some of our listeners. So the researchers suggest endotoxins. These endotoxins come from bacteria that can die in the rumen. This relates to some of the sera and rumen acidosis risk. Histamine, again, can be another cause of this. Again, another factor in the feeding program there. And accumulation of lactic acid can cause this vascular event to occur, and that, of course, has got sera written all over it. So certainly these are some of the risks that we have in terms of why we're seeing this painful event out there on the hooves. So let's wrap this up and then say, well, what are some of the factors that may weaken this suspensory apparatus in the hoof besides the laminitis that we just talked about? There are certain enzymes that can break down and weaken some of the fibers in the corneum. Metalloproteinases, this also may be coming from the rumen, from breakdowns of feedstuffs in the digestive, in the rumen itself there. Some researchers say, time of calving, we have hormonal changes occur, and the one that quickly comes to mind is relaxin. This allows for the ease of birth of the calf. Well, this may also have some hoof effects there as well. And then there may be some other factors, either nutritionally or management-wise, that affects the fiber bundles in the hoof itself. So certainly lots of things to think about. A hoof trimmer or a veterinarian like Nigel Cook could probably even expand even more on that. In fact, I think, Steve, the topic is so important that maybe in the future we may want to schedule a webinar specifically in that area as well. I didn't know where to put this PowerPoint, but it's a very important one. There's always, in every webinar, there are 4 or 5 important PowerPoints. This is one of them. And on every farm, you've got this line that says there's probably 2 incriminating problems on the dairy farm. Rumen acidosis and or nutrition up here. This has caused exposure to concrete. Some people call it concrete-itis. I'd like to call this a cow comfort, the environment the cow finds herself in. And so this line may move up in this direction, which means the environment is a bigger problem. And Steve, you already identified heat stress is a huge factor that can cause laminitis, just the heat stress itself because of blood flow, cows trying to cool themselves and standing more. Or you might see the shift down here, in fact, if the diet is incorrect. And so today we're going to be spending most of our time in this part of the triangle up here. But don't forget about this one. This one's going to be, in some farms, more important than when we talk about nutrition. So, Steve, hopefully we spent about 15, 16 minutes. We're right on time schedule. And now we come to really the title or the meat and potatoes of the feed factors that can be important. I thought it was important that we discuss kind of what we meant by laminitis, what we meant by locomotion scoring, and why farmers and veterinarians, hoof trimmers, and consumers have this on their radar screen out there on dairy farms. So let's start then looking at our feeding factors, and hopefully we'll have some questions pop up towards the end of the webinar as we get going through here. So certainly here is the big 100-pound gorilla that everybody talks about, and that is the rapidly available, accessible, fermentable carbohydrates. And when you have lots of fermentable carbohydrates, and we're talking primarily here of starches and to a lesser extent sugar, we'll comment on that in just a few minutes, but we're looking at carbohydrates that really will shift and exceed the volatile fatty acids, VFA. Volatile fatty acids exceed, we have more acids being produced than perhaps what the rumen wall can absorb. So then we start seeing accumulation. This could be due to the diet. This could be due to the papillae. This could be due to the transition diet. There's lots of reasons why this could have happened. We have a very nice visual to show you here in just a minute from the University of Illinois. When this starts happening, then we start seeing reduction in rumen pH. And kind of the magic number to get us in the laminitis is, I'm saying 5.5. Some people would say that's 5.7. 5.8. I'll let you argue that yourself. I think the point is at some point the rumen is in trouble. When that happens, then we have these lactic acid bacteria. Certain species proliferate and they produce lactic acid. And this is one of the things we talked about that can really cause problems in the hoof area, is this lactic acid that appears into the bloodstream. That then leads into this vasoactive substances that get into the bloodstream. And of course that bloodstream goes down into the hoof, and it can affect the laminite itself. So that's kind of the cascade of the problem. So now we got this beautiful slide that actually Jim Baltz redid for me. Boy, Jim, he did a beautiful job on it. And it simply says, here we go. Now, this is an old slide from Dr. Carl Davis. Some of our listeners will recognize that name. Carl is doing quite well along with Jimmy Clark. Both people retired now. You can change this hay to as forage. And Steve, maybe we should just call this UNDF. Or maybe we should call this one over here soluble carbohydrates, 7-hour test. So there are numbers that maybe we can modernize this slide and call this UNDF, and this is basically soluble fermentable carbohydrate in the rumen. And of course, this would be the ration. So here you can see as we go from the left side to the right side, we tend to put more challenges into the rumen. Over here, I have a veterinarian friend that calls these safe diets. And he's got his one diet so safe that the cows are producing very low milk components, so just be careful. So again, you can see the green area. This is where you have high levels of acetic acid. Acetic acid is a major energy source. Typically about 65% of the VFAs are going to be acetic acid. And of course, the mammary gland can take that in synthesized milk fat. And so that's why one sign that we get going this direction could be a sign of lower butterfat tests out there as well. My veterinarian was concerned because we had huge fiber levels in the diet, and yet the butterfat test was 3.1. The protein was 2.8 though, and you might begin to ask, are the bacteria really in trouble? You can see as we go over here into what the white area, and that is where most of my modern dairy farmers are going to be, right over here, where we're going to get an increase in propionic production. That makes us blood glucose. Blood glucose is critical for ovarian, for reproductive function, also for synthesis of milk sugar or lactose. So we're going to be operating this area here, and that's right around that pH 6 that a lot of people use as a cutoff point for acidosis. For Sarah, usually it's going from 6 to about 5.4, 5.5.6. So this would be the Sarah range right over here. Over here, you're into the acute acidosis, and sure enough, here is your lactic acid building up. And this is a very strong acid that can really shift rumen microbes and also have impact on the hoof that we talked about a bit earlier. So a very powerful visual that as nutritionists and veterinarians, we're really trying to say, got to stay out of that Fighting Illini orange over here. You better stay in that Wisconsin red, in this case white area right over here. So the question is, this has got laminitis and lameness stamped all over it. You and I can't see it, but it's there. So what could be some of the signs of acidosis? Well, I thought we would just put this list up here. I like the first one, although very controversial. Free choice sodium bicarb consumption. The research, farmers tell me they see some real nice improvement with this. However, this does not take the bicarb out of the diet, and this is honest to God sodium bicarb. Should not be S-carb because that's fairly unpalatable. I tell you, bicarb is not palatable either if you brush your teeth with bicarb under your dentist as well. Our guideline is should be less than about a tenth of a pound or 45 grams per cow per day. If you see cows on average eating more of this, then you begin to raise some red flags. Why are they going after this feed additive? Another one is shifts in dry matter intake. We call that the yo-yo effect. Simply says in, say, an early lactation group or a fresh cow group, they're eating, let's say the high group is feeding 50 pounds of dry matter, and suddenly they drop down to maybe 48 pounds of dry matter, which would be about a 2-pound shift. That's my trigger. When is a dry matter change occurring in the herd? Now, Steve, you mentioned heat stress, and of course that could be a factor as well, right? Today here in Wisconsin and here in Illinois as well. And we call yo-yo effect because the cow goes off feed for a couple of days. She starts feeling good, and so she says, let's go back to the feed bunk and really catch up for lost time. And then we go up and down, up and down. We talked about laminitis. This is my definition. If you have more than 10% of your cows score 3, you might have a laminitis issue and foot disorder on your farm. Changes in manure dropping. I like to follow manure droppings. Manure scores on a score of 1 to 5. Remember, most of us want 3s. When you see a lot of cows at a 2.5 or less, that might be a sign of abnormal feed intakes or abnormal rumen fermentation going on. And then in some cases, we'll see cows that's really funky behavioral characteristics. They will actually eat dirt. They'll eat bedding. I've seen them chewing on planks on a wood fence. I've actually seen cows in some research studies at the University of Wisconsin actually go out into a manure stack and actually eat soiled manure bedding, that straw that was in that pack as well. I want to alert our listeners today, not only as far as Sarah, but the Wisconsin people say this is a real risk time right here in the transition period. I mean, cows are coming off, and according to Jim Drakely, about a third of the cows in the United States are in what we call the high straw, low energy diet, and we put them in a fresh cow ration. Some farmers move them right into the high group, and right away we're shifting the rumen microbial population. This may take 10 to 14 days. I like to say if we're going to make a change, trying to look at rumen environment, give me at least 21 days to occur. Our research at Illinois said, Steve, when you and I were grad students there, this could happen in 7 or 10 days here. And you're going to really shift these microbes. And so you were on a high fiber digester type diet. You may now be favoring the rumen pH and rumen nutrients for a starch digester. There is some controversy on rumen papillae. We know that these are the dudes that are going to absorb VFAs if for some reason they are not developed for totally challenged, which may be related to their diet at that point. It may take several weeks for these cows to occur. One researcher says 6 to 8 weeks. Some people say 3 to 4 weeks here. And if you have any acidosis that would be occurring, you can see these papillae develop very unusual shapes. You can see them clumping. And if they clump up, that can cause an ulcer. And of course, if you have ulceration, then you can see this bleeding of the nose of these cattle and liver problems because you actually see some bacteria getting into the bloodstream, and the liver has to deal with this, and the lung tissue does as well. So here we go, Steve. We got another poll coming right here at 25-minute mark, and this is the tough one. Here we go. Which of the factors is most important to manage to reduce lameness? And we're going to come through all these here in just a few minutes, but let's see what people are thinking. First one is the rate of passage. Too high. Feed engorgement, cows that are slug feeding, selective feeding there. Number 3, the physical form of the ration. Number 4, the rumen fermentable carbohydrate levels, and polyunsaturated fats or PUFAs. So, Steve, I'll turn it open to you, and what are you thinking there, my man?
Well, I'm going to take a stab at fermentable carbohydrates, Mike. I'm sure that they all can play a role. But I do know that, carbohydrate levels might be the most important. Let's see what everyone else says. And the voting is brisk again on this issue. So well, listen, I'd have guessed, I don't know what the answer is, but I think I went with the most popular vote.
Let's show this to our listeners here. And you know what, Steve? I don't have a favorite answer here either. You were right. You stole my thunder here, fella. And that is that all of these are factors. And you're right. The most popular one, 2/3 of the people voted for rumen fermentable carbohydrates. These must be the Donald Trump people. That's all I can figure out now. We'll just leave it at that. But all of these are important. So, Jim, I'm going to try to, you can close that, and I'm going to move forward. And you're saying, Steve, I would have voted with you had I had to put a vote on here as well. So let's go ahead and we'll try to move forward here. Let's say a quick word about this. Sugars and starches. These are your fermentable carbohydrates. The good news is that your soluble fibers, which also rumen fermentable carbohydrates, the good news, they tend to produce acetic acid and do not produce a high level of propionic acid. So they're kind of our buddies out there. And that's why some of us have our feed soy hulls and beet pulp and corn gluten feed, because we have a different source of carbohydrate in the rumen. Here's our starch levels. Notice the range. Huge, huge range. If I was going to tighten this down to 24 to 28, if I was going to tighten it down, but if you look at the literature from Michigan State and some of the work that's coming out of the Minor Institute, you can see these wider numbers popping up here as well. So starch level is just one factor that comes into play. The next one will be the rumen starch availability. In fact, at the four-state conference, Fred Owens, retired now and consulting and worked with Pioneer and was a big-time researcher, he reported at the four-state conference starch availability in the rumen on corn. He was looking only at corn and corn silage and high moisture corn. 55% availability. This would be your dry, unfermented corn, up to over 85% or over 80%. This would be your corn silage that is 35, 32, 31% dry matter that's been stored for 6 or greater months. Some of your high moisture corns that have been stored for 6 months can also approach this as well. This is smoke. This is dynamite in the rumen as far as what it could do for laminitis and availability out there in the feeding program. You can also take a look at your starch sources. We know that wheat is the Speedy Gonzales, and this is an important characteristic of some of our European people. Wheat is commonly found there as well. Barley, our Canadian co-workers, is another fast carbohydrate. Corn is modestly slow, but remember this number up here. We can make corn really different depending on how we grind it, how we steam flake it, how we put it up as high moisture corn, and then your sorghum grain would be even a little bit slower sitting out over here. And then, of course, we already talked about, already insinuated, storage time and processing becomes huge. For example, cracking corn, ground corn, 1,000 microns, 500 microns, high moisture corn, all those things come into play as well. Here gets sugar. We put this down here because that's another fermentable carbohydrate. And I don't want my listeners to leave the webinar saying, well, gee, just take the sugar out. We think you should be at 5 or 7% sugar to balance the need for the carbohydrates and the soluble fiber, or I should say the soluble starch and the soluble fiber sources there. There's some really neat work out of the University of Wisconsin and showing that this sugar will enhance NDF digestibility. And that's always a plus when you look at feeding programs. So 5 to 7% is where we'd like to have our total sugar levels be, somewhere around 25, 26, 27% total starch, and somewhere around 10 or 11% soluble fiber in the rumen. That'll add up to something over 39, and we think that's the magic number. Something over 39 to 41 to 42 as rumen fermentable carbohydrates split amongst those three different fractions. That should hopefully keep us out of the laminitis and hoof disorder problem. So let's take a look at the fiber numbers, and I'll let you read those at your leisure. Fiber is another factor. So this is our chemical fiber. We talked about the rumen fermentable carbs. That was sugars and starches primarily. Here's your fibers. Here's your NDF. And of course, we're pretty much using now the amylase-treated, ash-reduced or removed NDF values, 28 to 33%. Listeners, if you're sitting up here, you better make really sure some of that NDF is going to be coming from beet pulp or one of our other byproduct feeds, citrus pulp, for example, because this is going to be a fill factor out there in the program. Steve, the real challenging number is UNDF30. I chose that number today. It's the one I have most comfort with. A lot of you are using UNDF240. 12 to 14% of the ration dry matter is UNDF, and that kind of has a rate impact. It also will have a fill factor coming into play. Effective NDF, we're going to use the Penn State box on that. We'll show those numbers in a bit. We're using somewhere around 19 to 21% effective NDF using some type of device to measuring that. And here sits your old-fashioned numbers that Steve, you and I grew up with, ADF and lignin, and I would like to take a look at those numbers as well. My colleague from Mexico, from New Mexico, basically we looked at his fiber numbers. It was 33% NDF, 20.9% ADF, and 4.5% lignin. I think that's a problem on the carbohydrate, as we'd say, very safe ration, but maybe not going to help me a great deal in milk production and or components. Physically effective fiber. A number of our farmers now have the Rumen monitors either on the collar or in the ear, and it looks like the magic number is 450. So now we can actually measure this on farms if you have that technology that Dr. Jeff Buelow discussed with us back in December, and that's on the HOARDS website if you want to review that. The old thumb rule is 550, 600 minutes a day, and this is probably the minimum number. This was done usually with watching cows chew their cud. Isn't that exciting research? And or using some type of a halter device developed in Europe as far as that goes. Another number I like is 5 pounds of feed particles. Usually that's forages, of course, over 18 millimeters in length or 3/4 of an inch. And that would be for our European people, that's about 2 kilograms. Bottom line, that's about 10% of the Penn State box. If you're getting 50 pounds of dry matter into the cows, if you got 10% in the top box, as we'd say, bingo, there it is. And of course, I'm using the Penn State box here, and our guidelines you're going to see here pop up right now. To get a physically effective fiber, we would like to have over 50% of the total ration dry matter. In this case, it's usually measured on a wet basis there in the top 2 boxes. And many of you have seen this slide before, and Jim Boltz just wants to throw up every time he sees this because he's seen it so many times. We did change a number, though, for some of you listeners. Notice on the top box, we've dropped this down just a little bit, 8%. That's based on some new data we saw coming out of Canada. A very nice study done by Dr. Obo there, and his number was 9% was the magic number to really maintain components and rumen health. Once you get up at 15%, 2 red lights go on. The question is, will they sort it? And then number 2, will that slow down intake as far as that goes? Here is the 3-box. I like the 3-box system. If some of you are looking at that, wow, that is really one of the really old boxes there. And so the second box, we want this to be over, and this is your TMR as far as that goes at over 40%. So you can see that if this is over 40 and this is 8 or 10, bingo, I've got my magic number. Here is the third screen and fourth bottom box, depending if you got the 3 or 4 box system. Here sits my haylage. That's what we like to see. And here sits my corn silage on effective fiber. This is the kernel processed 3/4 inch, 18 millimeter chop kernel processor. And we'd be over 50%. In fact, in really good chops, this will be 60%. Some of you will have shredlage out there. And if it's shredlage, then this will be split up about 50-50. Randy Shaver's data would say somewhere around 30 to 33% in the top box, somewhere around 30 to 35% in the middle box. So that depends on the type of unit you have out there on your farm. Reducing feed sorting, a very busy slide, and our time rapidly is getting away on us here, Jim. And Steve, we're going to keep pounding through this. Feed sorting can be a real problem out there, and these are all guidelines that Dr. Randy Shaver had in one of his discussions about 2 years ago, and I thought it was great points. Any way that we can try to reduce. By reducing particle size, we didn't say grind the ration really short, either with your vertical mixer or tub grinder. We just say kick it down to less than 2 inches. And there is research in Wisconsin that says 2 inches is the magic number. Anything over 2 inches, the cow may want to sort out, especially if it's straw or low quality. So, and that's about half the width of a muzzle of a Holstein dairy cow. Obviously, high quality. In fact, we've been on farms in which the haylage comes out of a bag and it still stays clumped. And if it's really good quality haylage, guess what these cows do? They will search out those clumps of haylage and scarf them down. Kind of like eating peanut M&Ms out of trail mix. I'm really good at that. You can also reduce the long particle feed in that. Could be hay or straw. And of course, any of these products simply holding it together and doing a better job out there in the feeding program. Steve, I've not seen this yet, but somebody's going to get rich and famous here. We see people going up and down the aisle every day pushing up feed. I think we're going to find a device that, what I would say, kind of lifts the feed that's not been sorted yet and mix that and then drop it back in front of the cow, kind of like a feed conveyor rototiller mixing system. And suddenly now I've got, instead of just pushing the fresh feed up, I now have these cows having to go through this feed one more time. Protein quality, this is controversial. There is some, I could find 2 papers in the literature which says protein can be a factor. This is sometimes a little difficult to separate from the source of the forage because it's pasture related. But high levels of RDP, and this is NRC, so it should be less than 11% of total ration dry matter is rumen degraded protein. And quality of protein, and if that's over, and it looks like I got pretty friendly with those percentage signs there as well. well. We may want to look at that. But when you start getting up to 18%, again, potential risk of having some impact on hoof hardness, and that may have some impact on rumen fermentation as well. And I would admit, in most of these cases, these are pasture-based feeding systems. Another factor on protein quality would be sulfur. Sulfur produces the sulfur-containing amino acids, and these are very important in hoof health, especially cysteine, as far as that goes. Our guideline is total sulfur around 0.25 to 0.28. Watch that number. A lot of rations will be way down here because we are not adding a source of a supplemental sulfur coming with our trace minerals out there in the feeding program. Plus, with our shutting down of coal burning and scrubbing, we're just seeing a lot less sulfur in our crops, especially some of our forages. Here comes your PUFAs. Nobody voted for PUFAs. Kind of interesting. PUFAs, of course, stand for polyunsaturated fatty acids. We're looking at 18.2, 18.3. And again, if this intrigues you, Tom Jenkins has an excellent webinar presented by HOARDS Dairyman you can go to looking at PUFAs and RUFAs, which includes your 18.1s. So polyunsaturated are 18.2, 18.4, and you can see impacts that it would have out there in terms of fiber digestibility. Our guideline for the total levels in most of my software programs, this is ration, looking to stay under 500 grams. Some people use 450 grams of PUFAs. If it happens to be a vegetable oil, such as coming from distillers' grains, we say no more than 225 grams of what we call free oil. This is the oil that is no longer in the seed. Fuzzy cottonseed would be in the seed form. And then we also have fish oil, probably not important anymore. It might be in Europe, but boy, fish meal is really expensive in the U.S. Copper, here are your minerals. We'll let you read those. Copper has an important part in tendons and some of the elastic tissue here. It also has an impact on superoxide reduction and has an impact on immunity. And our guidelines here, 10 or 15 parts per million with a quarter to a third of it coming from organic sources. Zinc is another very important one, and you can see that enzymes are very important here as we come through it, and it has huge impacts on wound healing, hairy heel wart, hoof rot. Think about those. Keratin synthesis, epithelial lining, hoof hardness. And again, you can see the levels we're suggesting 40 to 60 parts per million. Again, a quarter to a third coming from organic sources. Here's the classic study on organic zinc. 3,000 cows in these studies pulled together. A significant reduction, as you can see, in different hoof disorders out here. You can read those at your leisure here, but certainly a pretty strong tie to hoof health. Other minerals, manganese, your sulfur-containing amino acids we talked about a bit earlier, and finally, calcium and phosphorus. And of course, Dr. Etzel, in one of his webinars, looked at looking at calcium boluses, transition cows. It had an impact on reducing lameness in older cows. A quick word on biotin. This is an additive, that a B vitamin is really a B vitamin, and you can see that it has an impact here. A lot of this work done in horses has an impact on milk yield. Here's our guidelines. You're going to see some data. Thought we'd share that with you. The cost-benefit ratio at least 4 to 1, depending on the price of milk and the price of biotin. Those are quite variable from time to time. Some older data looking at rumen effects, looking at synthesis of biotin. You can see as we go into the higher concentrate diets, and a lot of our lactating cows are over here. You can see a lower level actually synthesis of the biotin. Here's a research study pulled together by Dr. Bulow, not Bulow, it would be Dr. Blowy, I'll get it right, from the UK. And he summarized a lot of this older research on it. You can see the different studies, different levels here on what effects biotin can have on these disorders as well. Here you can see white line disease. Again, here now you can see the 20 milligrams popping up here in the research is referenced over here. And I thought this one was interesting, Steve and Jim. You can see pasture cattle. We even saw some response on those animals as well. Another study looked at the occurrence, published data here. You can see biotin takes about 6 months for it to have some biological effect on the hoof itself. Milk response is much quicker, and you can see by about 150 days here they start separating, and this is a cumulative total, but you can see a pretty marked impact on biotin in terms of lame cows out in this study as well. We then start winding up here. We have one more point to cover, and that is feed additives. You can see these are the feed additives that I think farmers would look at, consultants would look at, veterinarians would look at, maybe even hoof trimmers out there. Rumen buffers, the suggested level, monensin for lactic acid production control, yeast products for rumen environment, organic zinc we covered, and we just covered the biotin, 15 or 20 milligrams per day. Remember, you almost got to, if you're going to go hoof health, it almost has to be continuous. Well, you know what, Steve? Once in a while people say, well, what's new out there? What's new out there? And so I thought we would wrap up our webinar looking at two new things, looking at body condition score and iodine. Our last poll. This will go quick. Go quick, vote quickly. Here we go. For you Democrats, Republicans, only two choices. First is lame cows lead to thin cows, or thin cows lead to lame cows. So the polls are open, and you're going to have to vote very, very quickly. We're not going to give you much time.
Okay, I'm going to take number one on that one. And because I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about lameness and all, I said you very seldom see a fat, lame cow.
Jim, we're going to close the polls. We're 60% in. And the good news, Steve, you are going to lose. You are going to lose. And we are going to see 75% agree with you. 25% would take my choice. And why would I pick that? And the answer is some brand new research. This is fascinating. It comes from the Cornell people, presented at several different conferences. And this is called the digital cushion in cows. And that cushion, you can see it laid out here. This is lipid material. High amounts of fat here in this cushion area here. And that's a fairly soft one, and that gives us some resiliency to the hoof there, and that is made up primarily of monounsaturated fatty acids. So now your PUFAs start coming into play here once again. And now we take a look at what happens to body condition score. We already covered the first part, and you can see this research. Cows which had the higher digital cushion had 15% lower lameness scores compared to the cows at low. And this really started to occur. This cushion was disappearing at about 120 days after calving. It was difference between first lactation cows and animals, older animals. So maybe one to think about here, and that is we might want to take a look at avoiding major body condition score shifts occurring on these animals. Kind of interesting data to think about. And Steve, your comment is excellent. Now, the other one we're going to talk about briefly, and that is EDDI. And that's a big name that we studied back in college. That's organic iodine. You can read that. Jim found the chemical structure listed over here. Notice this. This data, some fairly new data, looking at adding 3.8 parts per million iodine to the total dry matter. It is not allowed for lactating cows. This is 6 times the NRC requirement, and that is because it pops up in the blood. That's why it's helping us in some lameness situation. Usually you will start adding this level 60 to 90 days before lesions appearing. Response is more effective in younger animals, and this is the legal maximum level for lactating cows that you can go with. I'll show you 2 quick studies. This is a Wisconsin study looking with steers, 120 Holstein steers. You can see the body weight, the recommended amounts of iodine there being used in this experimental study. Lesions, you can look at the lesion diameter, and you can see the iodine reduce that, but here's the big one. This is what they call the M2. If you go to lesions, there's M1, M2, M3, M4, M2 lesions. These are the acute, active, and ulcerated ones. They're over 2 centimeters. You can see the iodine had a trend of reducing it. So certainly interesting looking for our beef colleagues. And a lot of our feedlots are really looking at this data pretty carefully. This is University of Wisconsin study. Again, 153 heifers here. These heifers were fed for 16 weeks, and you can see a very low level of disorders on these animals here with digital dermatitis out here, 6.1% control heifers, 2.5%, and you can see statistically significant at the 0.5 level, and of course had some risk assessment and reduced the incidences of repeats occurring as well. So when we look at minimizing lameness on farms, today, Steve, as we wrap up here, we spent all our time on nutrition. These other 3 factors are equally important and maybe be covered in another webinar at this point. On our future, yeah, things are going to change. I think we're seeing now some other ways other than just looking at cows where we can actually measure as they walk out of the parlor, their head bob, their gait, their structure there electronically. I think we'll see that coming. Cow comfort becomes a huge factor in heat stress. nutrition we covered here, and maybe even genetics. We saw Zoetis already has got some work done in that area. As I wrap up, what a great reference. I want to recognize this. This is an excellent publication, brand new publication that came out. I got mine online through the bookstore there, and it's developed. It's got a lot of plastic transparencies. It's got some international authors in on this one as well. Looking at hoof structure, it is just excellent. You may want to add that to your shelf as well. So in summary, 2 very quick points. It's out there. And we really got to be aware of that. And this is going to be highly visible and could be important on animal welfare issues. And because we don't see it quite as much, sometimes we don't react to it as quickly as we should. So, Steve, we'll turn the program back to you to kind of bless it and see if we have any questions we'll try to answer. Maybe Steve is not going to take control.
Had to bring myself back to life here, Mike. Great job, as usual. Packed a lot of very interesting and some new information into a pretty fast 50 minutes. So we thank you so much for your presentation, and also again Zinpro, of course, for their support. Just a note to our participants that this webinar and all of the previous ones are going to be available through the HOARDS Dairyman website. Go to the webinar archives, and they're all there available for you to make use of. In a few days, each of you will be getting a very short survey. We appreciate your response on that to help us keep our series meaningful to you. And looking ahead, August 8th, next webinar, calf specialist Bob James from Virginia Tech, an update on raising better calves, always a popular topic, sponsored by De Laval. And then looking a bit further ahead, September 12th, fine-tuning transition cow care by a colleague of yours, Mike, down at the University of Illinois, Phil Cardoso, and that's sponsored by Angie Nomoto, Heartland. And before September 12th, I'll learn how to make sure that I'm actually saying that correctly. But there it is in print for you to guess at. And again, we're back to that slide, and again, we appreciate Zinpro's sponsorship today, and the good job that they've done through the years on improving hoof health on our dairy farms. So, Mike, are there some questions for you to deal with?
Yeah, we have a couple here, Steve, that we can go through and try to answer as best we can. Let's take the toughest one up there. It says, how quickly will a ration change be reflected in hoof health, good or bad? And I think that's a tremendously good question and very biased Hutchins answer. I think if it's bad news, in other words, you've caused SARA or transition feeding program, it looks like it's going to probably take at least 6 weeks to 2 months before you might see that occurring. So I think as far as getting into trouble, in other words, if I put a SARA ration in my herd here at the U of I here today, I'm not sure I would see a hoof response in a matter of a week. I might see effect in manure scoring. I might see an effect in milk yield and dry matter intake, or a rumen effect, but certainly I don't think I'll see the hoof effect. So that would be my take on it. 6 weeks thereabouts. Now, the bad news is, okay, I've buggered up the hooves, and we have seen this happen, unfortunately, on farms, too many farms here. And in some cases, it takes a good hoof trimming. It may take several months for this cow to respond, and in some cases, they don't respond well at all. And so these ends up being your culled cows coming into play. Notice the biotin work. It said a minimum of 6 months. The researchers would say at least 6 months. Some people say 1 year before you can say, I put biotin in, and yep, we saw a response. So again, I think it simply shows that you don't correct these things very quickly as far as that goes here. Another question up there, what about field beans as a starch source? Field beans, I assume he's talking soybeans. We also could have some other beans as well. I don't believe, at least on soybeans, there's not much starch in them. They're pretty heavily endowed with protein out there in the program. So again, that starch level, Steve, I just don't know the answer to what it is. We can try to look that up and maybe answer that in the magazine or something like that, what that starch level would be. Again, depending how you process those beans, again, depending if they're like a pinto bean or a soybean or one of those as well. Next question, interesting politically one. Why is your recommendation for the Penn State particle separator different than what's proposed by Penn State? And I know it's primarily with the top screen, I think is where the big difference is. The other thing that we decided was that we weren't going to give the big ranges. Penn State, for example, said in their middle box, when they had a 3-box system, 30 to 50%. That's a really big range. And so we decided to crack it down. We did a lot of shakeouts on some very good herds in Illinois, and we based our recommendation on some field studies and some field work that we did there. The Canadian work helps me a little bit on the top screen there. I have a good colleague of mine who doesn't care if there's anything on the top screen, and I struggle with that. I think we have to have some material on the top screen or consumed by the cow. We just can't live off the second screen. I wouldn't disagree with those of you out there. The second screen is important. So that's the bias. That's the Hutchins bias. If you want the Penn State screen, which I think is something like the top screen, 6 to 10% like that, have at it. They're in that 9% range, but the Canadian data I found very, very interesting. Another question that I think I can answer, although I'm not the expert on this, and that is there a difference in relative bioavailability, effectiveness of the iodine sources, EDDI versus the iodide and the iodate? And there's some work that Jim found many years ago when they actually they tracked blood levels. And the answer is yes, there was some differences. There was some differences. The organic appeared to have higher blood levels in the study that I looked at that point. I also went in and talked to Mike Saha, and the question is, how quickly does it clear the blood? Because I thought somebody might ask, could I feed to the dry cows? And the answer is, yeah, you can feed to the dry cows. You can't feed the lactating cows because it pops in the blood. And again, Mike said, and looking at this research paper, was that it did clear the blood relatively fast, within days, the organic and the inorganic, both of them at this point. The research on the iodine that I cited for the beef steers and for the replacement heifers was organic iodine that was being used in those studies, just so we're clear on that. And again, heifers, I think we're starting to see people starting to hoof trim heifers because a lot of our heifers aren't out on pasture and they're on manure packs or in their wet conditions, and we start seeing some problems with hoof health as well. The last question, Steve, and then we'll let you wrap this up unless something comes in here, and that has to do with immunity. And I guess my literature review, I just didn't find much on immunity. Obviously, when you've got digital dermatitis or hairy heel wart, we have an open wound. And now the immune system has to deal with that. Same thing with hoof rot. And so we know immunity is a huge issue coming now on some of the small intestine, leaky gut discussions, mastitis, whole area there. So, I think that's going to be interesting. So maybe I wanted to put some immune stimulators in there. And of course, some of the trace minerals such as selenium, zinc, and copper champion that, and manganese just a little bit as well. But manganese, I should make sure it's clear on that. It would have some of that plus going with it. So again, boy, that's a tough one. I looked, Jim looked, we did a bit of a literature search and couldn't kind of find much about it on it as well. So, Steve, I think we still got 3 minutes to go, but I think we've answered all the questions we have on this end here. I'll turn it back to you to wrap it up.
Mike. All right. Well, thank you again, Mike, for a wonderful presentation. Like I said, lots of information, some really new thinking for all of us to consider and as we go forward. And again, thanks to ZenPro, thanks to your partner down there, Jim Baltz, for his work. Patty Urchin up here at the Wisconsin office, HOARDS Dairyman office. And thanks for me here, Steve Larson on the editorial staff of the magazine. And just another reminder, webinars coming up. Bob James, calf specialist, Virginia Tech, August 8th. De La Val, bringing that to us. September 12th. Transition Cow Care, Phil Cardoso, also down there at the University of Illinois, sponsored by, as you know, Tomoto Heartland. So with those comments, it's 1 o'clock up here Central Time in Wisconsin, and we're wrapping her up for today. Thanks for all of you. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and we hope to have you join us again on future webinars.